a story that will stay with you. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in ways you never expected? A single moment of kindness, a chance encounter, or a decision made in the face of uncertainty. Sometimes those are the moments that define us. This is the story of David, a man who had spent his life drifting, never belonging anywhere. And Olivia, a woman who had everything money could buy, except the one thing she truly needed. When their worlds collided, everything changed. A lost little girl, a love that defied expectations, a journey of redemption, sacrifice, and the kind of happiness that money could never buy. As you follow their journey, be prepared to feel every emotion, joy, heartbreak, and ultimately, the warmth of a love that transforms lives. If you believe in second chances, in love that finds you when you least expect it, and in stories that stay with you long after the last word is read, this is for you. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now settle in and let's dive into a tale of love, loss, and the beauty of finding home in the most unexpected places. A struggling mechanic helped a lost child. The next morning, he woke up to a fleet of luxury cars. Now, the winter night had settled heavily over the quiet town, the streets coated in a thin layer of frost. Inside a small, dimly lit garage on the outskirts of town, David Carter wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag. The day had been long, filled with oil changes, engine diagnostics, and the usual struggles of keeping a small business afloat. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air, and turned off the flickering fluorescent light above his workbench. As he stepped outside, ready to lock up, a gust of wind bit at his face, making him tighten his coat around his broad frame. The stillness of the night was deceptive. In the distance, the occasional hum of a passing car disrupted the eerie silence. But something else tugged at David's attention. A faint rustling near the alley adjacent to his garage made him pause. He listened intently, his senses sharpening. Then a soft sniffle, followed by a barely audible whimper. David frowned. He scanned the dimly lit surroundings before cautiously making his way toward the sound, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. As he turned the corner, the sight before him made his breath hitch. A small figure was curled up against the wall of the building, half hidden in the shadows. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, sat huddled in a thin pink coat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her golden hair was tangled, her cheeks red from the biting cold, and her large blue eyes, wide with fear, shimmered with unshed tears. "Hey there, kid," David said gently, crouching down to her level so he wouldn't appear intimidating. His voice was deep but softened by genuine concern. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl flinched slightly at his voice but didn't move away. She stared at him, wary yet desperate, her lips trembling as she hugged herself tighter. David's chest tightened. This wasn't right. No child should be out here, especially not in this kind of weather. He quickly looked around, expecting, hoping, to see a frantic parent searching for her. But the streets were empty, nothing but the cold wind sweeping through the town. "Are you lost?" he tried again, his voice calm and patient. A slow, hesitant nod was her only response. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had never been particularly good with kids, but he knew enough to recognize fear when he saw it, and this little girl was terrified. "All right," he said softly, nodding in return. "Let's get you inside where it's warm. We'll figure this out together." She hesitated for a long moment, but then, as if surrendering to exhaustion, she slowly reached out her tiny, ice-cold hand. David took it gently in his own rough, calloused grip and guided her inside. The warmth of the garage greeted them as he flipped on the heater. He led her to an old couch he kept in the corner, where she sank into the worn fabric, her small body still trembling. He grabbed the thickest blanket he could find and draped it over her delicate frame. "Better?" he asked, crouching down in front of her again. The girl gave a small nod, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "All right," David said, pulling up a chair. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated again before whispering, "Amelia." "That's a pretty name," he said with a small smile. "I'm David. Nice to meet you, Amelia." She didn't respond, just lowered her gaze to her lap. David could see her tiny hands still trembling beneath the blanket. He didn't press her further, sensing that she needed time to feel safe. Instead, he walked over to a small cabinet and rummaged around until he found an unopened bottle of apple juice he kept for his occasional young customers. He handed it to her, and she took it hesitantly. "Drink up. It'll help warm you up a bit." Amelia took a small sip, her fingers barely able to hold the bottle steady. David sat back, watching her carefully. "Do you know where you live?" he asked gently. She hesitated again before shaking her head. David exhaled slowly. This wasn't good. A lost child, out in the freezing night, with no idea how to get home. He reached for his phone, considering calling the police, but something made him pause. Amelia's wide, frightened eyes followed his every move, as if she was afraid of what he might do next. Instead of dialing, he put the phone down. "We'll figure this out in the morning, all right? You can stay here tonight where it's safe." The relief in her expression was subtle but there. She curled up under the blanket, exhaustion overcoming her small body. Within minutes, she was asleep. David sat there for a long time, watching over her, his mind racing. Who was she? Where were her parents? And why did she seem so afraid? His fingers absently traced the old scars on his hands, a reminder of the past he rarely allowed himself to think about. He knew what it was like to be lost, to be abandoned, and he knew the kind of fear that clung to you long after the cold had faded. As he leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw, one thing became clear. This night was far from over, and somehow he knew his life was about to change in ways he never could have expected. David woke before dawn, the familiar hum of the garage's heater filling the space with a low, steady warmth. He stretched his stiff muscles before glancing toward the couch. Amelia was still there, curled into a small ball beneath a thick blanket, her golden hair spilling over the fabric. For a moment, he simply watched her, wondering what could have led a little girl like her to be alone on the streets. As if sensing his gaze, Amelia stirred. Her blue eyes fluttered open, blinking at her unfamiliar surroundings. When she spotted David sitting nearby, she tensed, her small hands gripping the blanket tightly. "Morning, kid," David said gently. "Sleep okay?" She hesitated before nodding slowly. "You hungry?" he asked, rising from his chair. "I got some toast and peanut butter. Not much, but it's warm." She hesitated again, but eventually nodded. David moved toward a small kitchenette in the back of the garage, where he quickly prepared a simple breakfast. When he returned, Amelia sat up, cautiously taking the plate from him. She ate slowly, her eyes darting toward the garage door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. David took a deep breath. "All right, kid, I need to know where you live. Someone's got to be looking for you." Amelia froze mid-bite, her small hands trembling slightly. Her gaze dropped to the plate, and she shook her head. "You don't remember, or you don't want to go back?" David pressed. She swallowed hard, still refusing to meet his eyes. "Mommy is gone," she whispered. David's chest tightened. He wasn't sure what that meant. Was her mother missing, dead, or simply absent? He leaned forward, keeping his voice calm. "What about your dad?" Her lips pressed together in a thin line. She shook her head once more. David exhaled slowly, trying to figure out his next move. He wasn't equipped to take care of a child, but there was no way he could just send her back out onto the streets. He needed help, and that meant calling the police. Before he could say anything else, the sharp screech of tires outside made them both jump. David turned toward the sound just as a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of the garage. The vehicle exuded wealth, its polished exterior gleaming under the dim morning light. David's instincts went on high alert as the car door opened, revealing a woman in a tailored dark coat and high heels. She stepped out with precise, deliberate movements, radiating an aura of power and control. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her icy blue eyes scanned the surroundings with practiced efficiency. Amelia stiffened beside him. "Amelia!" The woman's voice was sharp, urgent. David looked between the child and the woman. There was no mistaking the resemblance. "Olivia Harrington," the woman said, her voice clipped as she turned her gaze on David. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." David folded his arms, his stance shifting slightly. "And who might you be?" The woman's expression barely wavered, though there was an undeniable edge of impatience. "I am her mother." David felt Amelia shrink beside him, and that single movement told him more than any words ever could. There was something more to this situation than a simple case of a lost child being reunited with her family. She was out in the cold, alone, David said, his voice steady but firm. Care to explain how that happened? Olivia's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. That is not your concern. Now, if you'll kindly hand over my daughter. She's scared, David interrupted, and she's not saying much. Maybe you should slow down and think about why that is. For the first time, something flickered in Olivia's expression, an almost imperceptible crack in her composure. But just as quickly, it was gone. She took a step forward, extending a hand toward Amelia. Come, Amelia, we're going home. The child didn't move. David felt a strange protectiveness rise within him. He had no reason to interfere, no right to question, but something about Olivia's demeanor didn't sit well with him. You sure that's what she wants? He asked quietly. Olivia's eyes snapped to his, the sharpness returning. Excuse me. David gestured toward Amelia. You might want to ask her first. For a long, tense moment, silence stretched between them. Then finally Olivia knelt down, her heels clicking softly against the concrete floor. Amelia, sweetheart. Her voice was softer now, though still laced with tension. Come with me. Amelia hesitated, her fingers clutching the fabric of the blanket David had given her. I'll make sure she's safe, Olivia added, as if sensing David's growing resistance. David studied her carefully. There was something guarded about her, but beneath that, something else. Something almost desperate. After another moment of silence, Amelia finally slowly moved toward her mother. Olivia took her hand, then straightened, regaining her icy composure. Thank you for keeping her safe, she said, though the words sounded more like an obligation than genuine gratitude. She turned toward the car, leading Amelia away. David watched them go, a strange feeling settling in his chest. He should have felt relieved that the child was back where she belonged, but somehow, something about this didn't feel right. As the car drove away, the air in the garage suddenly felt colder. David had a gut feeling that this wasn't the last time he'd see Olivia Harrington, and deep down, he wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The days following Amelia's departure left a strange emptiness in David's garage. He told himself he shouldn't have been affected. After all, she wasn't his responsibility. He'd done his part, kept her safe, fed her, made sure she got back to where she belonged. And yet the memory of the little girl, huddled beneath his old blanket, lingered like a ghost he couldn't shake. Business went on as usual. The occasional customer rolled in, asking for a quick oil change or help diagnosing a faulty transmission. But David found himself distracted, checking the news and skimming through local headlines, searching for any mention of Amelia Harrington. There was nothing. It was as if the night she had appeared in his life had never happened. Yet David couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then on a quiet afternoon, the unmistakable hum of an expensive engine pulled his attention from under the hood of a car. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside, his brows furrowing at the sight of a sleek black sedan parked just outside the garage. The driver's side door opened, and from it emerged Olivia Harrington. David exhaled, not entirely surprised, but not exactly pleased either. He'd known deep down that their encounter wasn't over. The way she had left, the stiffness in Amelia's body when she took her mother's hand, something had felt unresolved. Olivia was dressed as impeccably as before, her tailored coat cinched at the waist, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached. But there was something different about her this time. The confident, icy exterior had softened, if only slightly. Her expression was guarded, but not as unreadable as before. David crossed his arms. Didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to be here. Olivia stopped a few feet away, glancing briefly at the garage before returning her gaze to him. But I suppose life has a way of leading us places we don't anticipate. David let out a dry chuckle. That's so. Didn't strike me as the type to believe in fate. Olivia's lips twitched in something that might have been amusement, but the expression was fleeting. She took a breath, straightening her shoulders. I came to say thank you. David arched a brow. For what? For taking care of my daughter. Her voice was measured, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of sincerity. "She hasn't stopped talking about you?" David glanced away, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. "She doing all right?" "She's, adjusting." Olivia hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "But she hasn't been herself since that night. She keeps asking about you, about this place." David frowned. "That a problem?" Olivia pursed her lips, then sighed. "I don't know." She paused, then added, "I think she feels safe with you." David studied her carefully. There was something in her voice, something unspoken but undeniable, a vulnerability she probably wasn't used to showing. "So, what do you want from me?" he asked, his tone neutral. She hesitated again, looking almost uncertain for the first time since he'd met her. "Would you be willing to see her again?" David blinked. That was the last thing he had expected her to say. "You serious?" "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." David let out a slow breath, weighing his options. He wasn't sure what he was stepping into, but something told him that this wasn't just about Amelia. This was about Olivia, too. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll see her." Olivia exhaled, almost as if relieved. "Good." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small card, handing it to him. "My number. Call me and we'll arrange something." David took the card, his fingers brushing against hers briefly before she withdrew. Their eyes met, and for the first time, he saw something beyond the polished exterior. A woman who, despite her wealth and power, was just as lost as he was. She turned back toward her car but paused with her hand on the door handle. "David," she said without looking at him, "Amelia doesn't talk about her father. She never has." David's brows furrowed. "Why tell me that?" "Because." Olivia finally turned to face him, her gaze filled with something unreadable. "She only talks about you." With that, she slipped into the car and drove away, leaving David standing in the crisp afternoon air, his mind swirling with questions. He had no idea what he had just agreed to, but somehow he knew his life was about to change yet again. The following evening, David found himself staring at the small white card Olivia had given him, her neatly printed number staring back at him. He had thought about tossing it, pretending none of this had happened, but something about the way she had looked at him before leaving lingered in his mind. She was not just a woman of power and wealth. There was something broken beneath that poised exterior. Something that spoke of exhaustion, of a life spent fighting battles no one could see. He wondered what kind of burden she carried, the kind that made a woman like her seem both untouchable and deeply alone. And Amelia had clung to him in a way that made it impossible to turn his back on her. David sighed, running a hand over his stubbled jaw before finally picking up his phone. He dialed the number, half hoping it would go straight to voicemail. It didn't. Olivia Harrington. Her voice was crisp, as composed as ever, but there was a slight edge of tension, as if she had been waiting for his call. "It's David." He hesitated, feeling strangely out of place. "Figured I'd take you up on that offer." A pause, then, "I'll send my driver." 7 o'clock tomorrow. David frowned. "I can drive myself." Another pause, then a quiet sigh. "All right, I'll text you the address." The call ended abruptly and David stared at his phone, shaking his head. This woman was going to be a challenge. The next evening, David found himself driving through an upscale neighborhood lined with perfectly manicured lawns and towering iron gates. His beat-up truck looked completely out of place against the backdrop of luxury vehicles parked in pristine driveways. When he reached the address Olivia had sent him, the sight of the grand estate nearly made him reconsider. The house was massive, with elegant stone columns and floor-to-ceiling windows that gleamed in the evening light. Before he could second-guess himself, the front door opened and a small figure came running out. "David!" Amelia's voice was filled with excitement as she sprinted across the driveway. David barely had time to react before she crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He instinctively steadied her, surprised by how tightly she clung to him. "Hey, kid," he murmured, ruffling her hair. "You been doing okay?" She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that told him otherwise. A moment later, Olivia appeared in the doorway, watching them with a guarded expression. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dark sweater and slacks, her usual polished appearance softened by the casual attire. For the first time, she looked less like a corporate powerhouse and more like a mother, uncertain and searching. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. David followed her inside, Amelia still clutching his hand. The interior of the house was just as grand as he expected. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and expensive furniture that probably cost more than his entire garage. But despite its beauty, the house felt empty, almost sterile, like a museum rather than a home. Olivia led them to a sitting room where a fireplace crackled softly. Amelia plopped down on the couch beside David, her small hand still gripping his sleeve. "Thank you for coming," Olivia said finally, settling into a chair across from him. David shrugged. "Didn't have much choice, did I?" He gestured toward Amelia, who was now watching him with expectant eyes. A flicker of something, amusement, maybe, crossed Olivia's face before she composed herself. "She's been asking about you constantly. I thought it might be best if she saw you." David glanced at Amelia. "That true, kid?" She nodded enthusiastically. "I missed you." Something in David's chest tightened at her words. He had never imagined himself being important to a child, especially one like Amelia, who came from a world so different from his own. Olivia shifted, clearing her throat. "I won't keep you long. I wanted to understand." David frowned. "Understand what?" She hesitated before speaking. "Why does she trust you?" David stared at her, taken aback by the question. He glanced at Amelia, who was now leaning against his side, completely at ease. He didn't know how to answer. "Sometimes it's not about understanding," he said finally. "Sometimes people just connect." Olivia looked down, something unreadable in her expression. "I don't know how to connect with her," she admitted quietly. David studied her carefully. For all her confidence and power, Olivia Harrington looked utterly lost in that moment. "Maybe you should stop trying so hard," he said gently. For the first time, Olivia looked up at him with something other than cool detachment. There was vulnerability in her eyes, a silent plea she probably didn't even realize she was making. She exhaled softly, rubbing a hand over her temple as if she was battling an exhaustion far deeper than physical fatigue. "I never had an example of what a good mother should be," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was raised by nannies and tutors. My parents, they weren't around." David leaned back, absorbing her words. It explained a lot: the controlled persona, the need to manage every detail of her life. He had seen people like her before, the ones who had built themselves into fortresses, too afraid to show weakness. "You don't have to be perfect," he said after a moment. "You just have to be there." Olivia let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "And what if I don't know how?" David shrugged. "Then maybe it's time to learn." The silence between them stretched, filled not with tension but with something unspoken, something fragile. Amelia, oblivious to the weight of the moment, simply nestled closer to David, her presence a quiet testament to the trust Olivia so desperately wished to understand. David wasn't sure what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The days that followed saw David reluctantly stepping into a role he had never expected, being a steady presence in Amelia's life. It started with brief visits, arranged through Olivia's terse phone calls. At first, the meetings were structured, almost clinical, like supervised visits dictated by a legal agreement neither had signed. But with each encounter, something shifted. Amelia's excitement whenever David arrived became impossible to ignore. She would race down the grand staircase with a gleeful shriek, her tiny feet barely touching the steps, and launch herself into his arms before he could even get a word out. She would chatter incessantly about her day, her new favorite stories, and the latest garden adventure she had embarked on. The child's laughter, once a rarity in the grand but lifeless Harrington estate, began to fill the halls. Olivia observed this change with an unreadable expression, often lingering in the doorway as David and Amelia played simple games, shared stories, or spent time in the estate's sprawling garden. She was always there, always watching, though she rarely engaged directly. Her presence was silent but heavy, as if she were trying to understand a foreign language that only David and Amelia spoke fluently. One afternoon, after a game of hide-and-seek left Amelia breathless with laughter, Olivia finally broke her silence. "I don't understand it." David, leaning against a stone bench, raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" "She's different with you," Olivia admitted, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "She's happier." David shrugged. "Maybe because I don't treat her like a business meeting." Olivia's expression tightened. "I don't." "You do," David interrupted gently. "You schedule time with her. You manage her life the way you do your company. Kids aren't projects, Olivia. They need time, patience, a reason to trust." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. Instead, she looked toward Amelia, who was attempting to balance on the edge of a garden fountain, arms spread wide like a tightrope walker. For a moment, Olivia's expression softened, her rigid stance wavering. "I never learned how," she confessed quietly. "I was given everything, except parents who were there." David studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Then maybe it's time to change that." Olivia's gaze flickered toward him, something hesitant in her eyes. He could see the battle within her, the desire to be better, to connect, fighting against years of conditioning that told her love was something to be earned, not given freely. A few days later, when Olivia called, her voice held none of the previous tension. "She wants to see your garage." David chuckled. "My garage?" "Yes," Olivia sighed, sounding almost amused herself. "Apparently she thinks it's magical." He smirked. "Then I guess I'd better clean up before royalty arrives." When they pulled up outside his modest auto shop, Amelia practically bounced out of the car, running toward the garage doors. Olivia, dressed more casually than he'd ever seen her, followed at a slower pace, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Inside, Amelia marveled at everything: tools, car parts, the old radio playing classic rock in the corner. She ran her fingers over the wrenches neatly hung on the wall and inspected the greasy engine block David had been working on earlier. "You fix things," she said, peering up at David with awe. "Just like you fixed me." David froze, momentarily stunned by the weight of her words. Olivia, too, seemed taken aback, her lips parting slightly as she watched her daughter with something close to wonder. It was the first time Amelia had expressed what she felt so directly, and it struck them both with the same unexpected force. Clearing his throat, David knelt beside Amelia. "You weren't broken, kid," he said softly, "just a little lost." Olivia inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the hem of her sweater. She had spent years believing that strength meant never needing anyone, that resilience was measured by how well she endured solitude. But as she looked at Amelia's small hands clutching David's sleeve, she felt something shift within her, an ache she had ignored for far too long. Could it really be so simple? Could love and connection be given freely, without expectation? Amelia smiled, but Olivia's gaze remained fixed on him. There was something different in her expression now, an understanding, perhaps, or the beginnings of a realization she wasn't quite ready to voice. And in that moment, David knew this was no longer just about Amelia. Olivia was beginning to change too, and so was he. The weeks passed, and the bond between David, Amelia, and Olivia continued to evolve in unexpected ways. What had started as an obligation, David fulfilling a role Olivia had reluctantly allowed, had transformed into something more natural, something undeniable. Amelia had found safety in David's presence, and Olivia, whether she admitted it or not, had found something equally unfamiliar, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. David had never considered himself the type to fit into someone else's world, especially not one as polished and controlled as Olivia Harrington's. He had spent years keeping to himself, avoiding entanglements that could make his life more complicated. Yet despite his initial hesitation, he found himself growing accustomed to the rhythm of Olivia's world. The way Amelia's laughter softened the edges of the pristine estate, the quiet moments when Olivia let her guard down, even the unease he felt when walking through spaces that didn't quite feel like his own. He wasn't sure if he belonged here, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't entirely certain he didn't. Yet here he was, invited back time and time again, feeling more at home in the grandeur of the Harrington estate than he ever thought possible. But peace was a fragile thing, and it rarely lasted long. One evening, as David closed up his garage, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching to a halt just outside caught his attention. He turned, wiping his hands on a rag, only to find a sleek black car idling at the curb. The headlights illuminated the dimly lit lot, casting long shadows across the pavement. David tensed. He recognized that kind of car, the kind that belonged to people who thought money and power made them untouchable. The door swung open, and a man stepped out, impeccably dressed in a dark suit. He exuded authority, the kind that made ordinary men feel small. But David had never been one to shrink in the face of intimidation. "You David Carter?" the man asked, his voice smooth, deliberate. David didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied the man, noting the confident stance, the way he adjusted his cufflinks like he had all the time in the world. This wasn't a friendly visit. "Who's asking?" David finally said, keeping his tone neutral. The man smirked, as if amused by the defiance. "The name's Richard Langley. I represent some very influential interests, people who take issue with certain associations." David's jaw tightened. "You're going to have to be more specific." Langley took a slow step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "Let's not play games. You know exactly what I mean." His eyes locked onto David's, sharp and assessing. "Olivia Harrington has a lot to lose. And people like you?" He let out a slow, deliberate exhale, his lips curling into a smirk. "You don't belong in her world." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his stance relaxed, refusing to let Langley see even a flicker of unease. His pulse drummed against his ribs, not out of fear, but out of anger. Anger at the way this man carried himself, as if he had the right to dictate who was worthy and who wasn't. He had seen men like Langley before, the ones who mistook wealth for power, who thought money could shape the world in their image. David had never bowed to men like that, and he sure as hell wasn't about to start now. David crossed his arms, refusing to be baited. "That's so!" Langley tilted his head slightly as if appraising him. "We both know this won't last. Olivia is pragmatic. She makes decisions with her head, not her heart. And if you think for 1 second she'll choose someone like you over everything she's built." He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, let's just say I'd hate to see you waste your time." David's fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't naive. He knew Olivia's world operated by different rules he had never played by. He understood that power and influence shaped decisions in her world, that deals were made behind closed doors where sentiment had no place. But Olivia wasn't just a product of that environment. She had defied expectations before, had chosen to let him into Amelia's life despite the disapproval of those around her. If there was one thing David knew, it was that Olivia Harrington wasn't someone who let others dictate her choices. Rules he had never played by. But he also knew one thing for certain. Olivia wasn't someone who let others dictate her choices. And Amelia, she deserved more than a life controlled by people like Langley. "I think you should leave," David said, his voice low, steady. Langley's smirk remained, but there was something colder in his eyes now. "Consider this a courtesy. Walk away, Carter, before this gets messy." With that, he turned, stepping back into the car. The engine purred to life, and in a matter of seconds, the vehicle disappeared into the night, leaving only the lingering weight of an unspoken threat. David exhaled slowly, his mind already working through the implications. This wasn't just about him. This was about Olivia, about Amelia. And if Langley thought intimidation would be enough to send him running, he had gravely miscalculated. David had spent his whole life fighting against the odds. From the moment he lost his father as a teenager and had to take on 2 jobs just to help his mother keep a roof over their heads, to the years he spent rebuilding himself after a betrayal that cost him everything, he had learned to survive in a world that never handed out favors. He knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be told he wasn't good enough, and he had spent his life proving people wrong. This time wouldn't be any different, and he wasn't about to stop now. The morning after Langley's visit, David sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped together, staring at the worn wooden floor of his small apartment. The warning had been clear: walk away or face the consequences. But the idea of leaving Olivia and Amelia to the wolves circling them didn't sit right with him. He had spent his life fighting battles no one else saw, and this was just another fight. Still, he knew Olivia needed to hear it from him. By midday, he drove toward her estate, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but when he arrived, the atmosphere felt different. The security at the gate barely spared him a glance before waving him through, something that had never happened before. As he pulled up to the grand entrance, Olivia was already standing outside, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. David stepped out of the truck, shutting the door behind him. "Figured we needed to talk." Her lips pressed together, and for a brief moment, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hesitation, fear, something she wasn't ready to admit. She turned on her heel and walked inside. He followed, his boots echoing against the pristine marble floors. Inside the sitting room, Olivia finally faced him. "Did Langley pay you a visit?" David wasn't surprised she knew. He nodded. "Last night. Told me to walk away." She exhaled a slow, measured breath. "You should." David's jaw tightened. "That what you want?" Silence stretched between them. Olivia's gaze wavered for a fraction of a second before she masked it with indifference. "It's what's best." "For who?" "For Amelia. For you. For me." Her voice held conviction, but it lacked the steel she usually wielded so effortlessly. "You don't understand, David. These people don't just threaten. They follow through." "I can handle myself." She let out a humorless laugh. "That's not the point. They don't just ruin people. They erase them. Their power doesn't come from money alone. It comes from influence, from knowing how to make problems disappear." She shook her head, her arms wrapping around herself. "I can't put you in that position. I won't." David took a step closer, his voice softer now. "And what about Amelia? You think keeping me away is what's best for her?" Her breath hitched, but she squared her shoulders. "She'll adjust." David felt something inside him twist. "You don't believe that?" Her silence was answer enough. For the first time since meeting her, he saw it, the fear she had tried so hard to conceal. Olivia Harrington, the woman who exuded power and control, was terrified, not just for herself, but for him. And that realization gutted him more than he cared to admit. He could fight for her, fight for Amelia, but he couldn't fight if she refused to let him. David nodded slowly, the weight of her decision settling over him like a crushing force. "All right," he said, his voice gruff. "If that's what you want." She flinched at his words, but she didn't stop him as he turned toward the door. Just as he reached the threshold, Amelia's voice rang out from the top of the staircase. "David?" He looked up to find her standing there, clutching the banister, her small face filled with confusion. He forced a smile despite the ache in his chest. "Hey, kid. Are you leaving?" His throat tightened. "Yeah, sweetheart, I am." Her brows knitted together. "Why?" David looked to Olivia, waiting for her to answer, to say something. But she only stood there, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands gripping her arms as if holding herself together. So David did the only thing he could. He lied. "Just gotta take care of some things," he said, his voice as steady as he could manage. "But I'll see you around, okay?" Amelia didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. "Okay." David gave her one last look before stepping outside. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed louder than it should have. As he got into his truck and drove away, the road blurred slightly in front of him. He told himself he had done the right thing, but it didn't feel like it. The absence of David lingered like an unwelcome shadow in the Harrington estate, stretching across every silent hallway, filling the empty spaces he had unknowingly occupied. Olivia told herself she had made the right decision. Distancing him was the only way to keep him safe. But the justification rang hollow in the cavernous stillness of her home. The once pristine order of her world felt unbalanced, as if something essential had been removed. Without realizing it, she found herself listening for the low rumble of his truck, half expecting Amelia's delighted squeals to echo through the halls. But all she heard was silence, and it was deafening. Amelia had stopped asking about him after the first few days, But Olivia could see the confusion in her daughter's eyes, the quiet sadness she tried to mask. It was a feeling Olivia knew too well. She had done what was necessary, or at least that's what she kept telling herself. She had protected David, ensured that he wouldn't become a target of the forces that loomed over her world. But the more she repeated it, the more hollow the words became. The signs had been there. Whispers in the hallways, uneasy glances exchanged between senior executives, emails that had suddenly gone unanswered. Olivia had noticed the shift but dismissed it, convincing herself that she still had control, that she always would. But when she walked into that boardroom, the truth hit her with a force that she hadn't braced for. It started with a board meeting, routine, scheduled weeks in advance. Olivia had walked in expecting the usual power plays and financial discussions. Instead, she was met with cold stares, guarded words, and an agenda that didn't include her. Richard Langley sat at the head of the table, his smirk barely concealed. "Olivia, I believe you've been working too hard. Perhaps it's time to take a step back." She felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "What is this?" Langley steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. "A transition of power. Investors have voiced concerns about your recent distractions." Olivia's pulse quickened. Distractions. The word slithered through the air, laced with something venomous. Her fingers tightened against the smooth surface of the conference table, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. Rage simmered beneath the surface, but she couldn't afford to let it show. Not yet. Not when the room was filled with vultures waiting for her to break. "Distractions?" she repeated, her voice steady, though every muscle in her body was wound tight. Langley's smirk deepened. "Your associations," he clarified, pausing just long enough to let the implication sink in. "Your inability to maintain the company's pristine image. You've shown weakness, Olivia, and weakness in this world has consequences." A cold knot formed in her stomach. They had been waiting for this moment, planning it, and she had been blind to it until now. Her jaw tightened. "Distractions?" "Your associations," Langley said smoothly. "Your inability to maintain the company's pristine image. You've shown weakness, Olivia, and weakness in this world has consequences." Betrayal burned in her chest, but Olivia didn't let it show. She had spent years mastering the art of control, of keeping her emotions buried beneath layers of steel. "You can't do this." "Oh, but we can," Langley replied, sliding a folder across the table. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer the alternative. A scandal would be unfortunate, especially one involving your child's welfare." A chill swept through her veins. "You wouldn't dare?" Langley's smirk widened. "Wouldn't I?" Olivia forced herself to breathe. They had cornered her, stripped her power away piece by piece, and now they were ready to deliver the final blow. She had spent her life playing by the rules of the elite, believing she could stay ahead of the game. But this wasn't a game anymore. It was war. By the time she left the building, the weight of what had just happened settled on her shoulders. She had lost everything. The company she built, the power she wielded, the security she had clung to for so long. And worst of all, she had done it alone. That night, she stood in the quiet of her home, the mansion that suddenly felt too big, too empty. The high ceilings loomed over her, the echoes of her own footsteps unnervingly loud. The once welcoming glow of the chandeliers now felt harsh, illuminating the hollow space she called home. A coldness settled in her chest, not from the temperature, but from the aching void left behind. She had spent years constructing a life of power and control, yet in this moment, it all felt meaningless. The silence pressed against her like a weight she could no longer bear. Amelia was asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just uprooted their lives. Olivia curled her fingers around the edge of the marble countertop, her chest tightening. For the first time in years, she had no plan, no strategy, no backup. She was utterly, completely alone. And then she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She picked up the phone. She hesitated only a moment before dialing. The line rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered. "David." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. David's breath caught, the sound of her voice slicing through the barriers he had tried to build. His grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing to decipher the unspoken plea in her tone. He had imagined this moment more times than he cared to admit, but not like this. Not with that raw edge of vulnerability laced beneath her words. For a long moment, he said nothing, torn between the instinct to shield himself and the undeniable pull to go to her. Then softly, she spoke the only words that mattered. "I need you." David gripped the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. His first instinct was hesitation. Was this another mistake? Hadn't he already made peace with walking away? But the tremor in Olivia's voice undid him, unraveling the careful distance he had tried to maintain. Relief warred with unease inside him. He had told himself she didn't need him, that she had chosen her world over his, but now, in this moment, she was reaching out. And he couldn't ignore it. He had spent weeks trying to push Olivia from his mind, convincing himself that walking away had been the right choice, that she had made her decision. But now hearing her voice, hearing the way it wavered, raw and unguarded, made every carefully built wall come crashing down. "I need you." Two simple words, but they carried the weight of everything unsaid. The loneliness, the regret, the fear. David exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. "Where are you?" "At home," she whispered, as if saying it out loud would shatter whatever composure she had left. "I'm on my way." The drive to the Harrington estate was a blur. The moment he pulled up, he barely had time to shut off the engine before Olivia opened the door. She wasn't in her usual polished attire. No expensive suits, no carefully curated armor. Just a loose sweater, her hair falling in waves around her face. She looked exhausted, drained in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She stepped back, allowing him in. The house was eerily silent, the weight of her downfall pressing against its walls. "What happened?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with concern. She let out a hollow laugh, though it held no real amusement, only exhaustion, raw and unfiltered. "I lost everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no rage, no outburst of frustration, just a quiet, sinking acceptance, as if the weight of her downfall had finally settled on her shoulders. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, but even that felt like a hollow gesture, as though she no longer had the strength to fight back. For the first time, Olivia Harrington looked truly defeated. David's jaw tightened. "Langley," she nodded. "They turned on me, took the company, threatened Amelia's future. I should have seen it coming." He studied her for a long moment. "And what do you need from me, Olivia?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know." She laughed bitterly. "For once in my life, I don't know." David took a slow step closer. "You called me." Her eyes met his. "Because you're the only one I trust." Something in his chest tightened. He had been prepared for anger, maybe even guilt. But trust, that was something he hadn't expected. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said quietly. She shook her head, her arms wrapping around herself. "I don't know how to do anything else." David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then it's time you learned." The silence between them was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Then Olivia did something he never thought he'd see. She stepped forward and leaned against him, just enough for him to feel the way her body trembled. For a moment he froze, startled by the rare vulnerability she allowed herself to show. He could feel her shallow breaths, the slight unsteadiness in her stance. His instinct was to pull away, to keep his distance, but something inside him resisted. Instead, he let himself be still, let her lean into him as the weight of everything she had lost settled between them. He swallowed hard, his hands hovering for a brief second before finally resting on her back. Tentative at first, then firm, offering the silent reassurance she didn't have to ask for. He wasn't sure if she was seeking comfort or simply trying to anchor herself, but either way, he wasn't going to let go first. For a moment he hesitated. Then slowly, he wrapped his arms around her, grounding her in a way that words never could. They stayed like that for a long time. Finally, Olivia pulled back, clearing her throat. "Amelia's upstairs. She doesn't know yet." Her voice faltered slightly, and she glanced toward the staircase, as if expecting her daughter to appear at any moment. I don't know how to tell her. She's already been through so much. She loves this home, the life I built for her, and now I have to explain that it's all gone. What if she blames me? What if she resents me? She let out a shaky breath, pressing her fingers to her temple. She'll see right through me, David. She always does. David nodded. Then we figure this out together. A ghost of a smile flickered across her lips. Together? He met her gaze. Yeah, together. Morning light filtered through the windows of the Harrington estate, casting golden rays across the grand hall. Yet despite the mansion's elegance, it felt hollow, stripped of the power Olivia once wielded. David had spent the night on the couch, though he barely slept. His mind replayed the last few months like an old film, each scene a reminder of how much had changed. He had walked away, convinced it was the right thing to do, only to find himself back here, drawn in by something he couldn't quite name. Was it obligation, a sense of unfinished business, or was it something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Olivia's face, the quiet plea in her voice when she had called. He had always thought of her world as something separate from his, but sitting here, in the dim glow of the fireplace, he wondered if that was ever really true, and if he had ever truly wanted it to be. He had expected Olivia to retreat behind her usual walls, but instead, she had sat beside him in silence, staring into the dim glow of the fireplace. Neither had spoken much, but words hadn't been necessary. She had reached for his presence, and for now, that was enough. A soft knock broke the stillness. David turned to see Amelia peeking from the staircase, her small frame dwarfed by the expanse of the house. She hesitated before stepping forward, her tiny feet barely making a sound against the cold floor. "Mom?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Olivia straightened, inhaling sharply. "Good morning, sweetheart." Amelia's gaze flickered between her mother and David before settling on Olivia. "Are we leaving?" David watched as Olivia's shoulders stiffened. He saw the battle waging in her, how much to tell her daughter, how much to shield her from the truth. Finally, Olivia knelt and opened her arms. Amelia hesitated only for a second before running into them, bearing her face against her mother's shoulder. Olivia let out a shaky breath as she pulled her daughter close, her fingers pressing into Amelia's back as though anchoring herself to the moment. She held her tighter than usual, the weight of everything she had lost colliding with the relief of having something, someone, she could still hold on to. Her shoulders trembled, but she refused to let the tears fall. Instead, she ran her fingers through Amelia's soft hair, whispering reassurances neither of them fully believed yet. Amelia didn't say anything, but the way she clung to her mother, small hands grasping tightly at her sweater, spoke volumes. Olivia exhaled, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's head, silently promising that no matter what, they would find a way forward together. "Yes, baby," Olivia murmured. "We have to go." Amelia sniffled but didn't argue. She simply clung to her mother, as if she had already known this moment was coming. David exhaled slowly. "I'll help pack." The day passed in a blur of quiet moments and unspoken grief. Olivia packed what she could, leaving behind the shell of a life she had once built with so much determination. The staff, those who had remained loyal, offered their silent goodbyes, though their eyes held uncertainty. The Harrington name still carried weight, but without the empire behind it, Olivia was no longer the woman they had once served. As the last bag was placed in the car, Olivia stood by the grand doorway, looking up at the towering house that no longer belonged to her. Memories swirled around her like ghosts. The first time she had walked through those doors filled with ambition, the night spent in her office, convinced that power would shield her from loneliness. The quiet moments when she watched Amelia play in the sun-drenched garden, believing she had built something unshakable. Now the house loomed over her, hollow and distant, a monument to the life she had lost. Yet as the weight of it pressed on her chest, a strange clarity emerged. It was just walls and floors, marble and glass. None of it had ever truly made her happy. With a slow exhale, she let the final pieces of the illusion slip away. "It's just a house," David said quietly, stepping beside her. She let out a slow breath. "It was more than that." David nodded. "Maybe." but it never made you happy." She turned to him, searching his face, as if trying to decipher the truth in his words. Finally, she allowed herself to admit, "No, it didn't." They left without looking back. The small rental home Olivia had secured was a far cry from the estate she had once owned, but it was warm and safe. And that, David knew, was what mattered. As he carried the last box inside, he found Olivia standing in the center of the modest living room, her eyes scanning the bare walls and simple furnishings. "Not exactly a palace," he said, setting the box down. Olivia turned, a slow smile playing at her lips. "Number, but maybe that's a good thing." Amelia's laughter rang from the next room, the first genuine sound of joy they had heard from her in days. David and Olivia exchanged glances, the tension in the air easing ever so slightly. They followed the sound and found Amelia sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered crayons and a half-finished drawing. She giggled as she held up a crayon-streaked masterpiece, a lopsided rendition of a house, with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. "This is our new home," she declared proudly. Olivia's throat tightened as she knelt beside her daughter, brushing a hand over Amelia's golden curls. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Her voice was thick with emotion, but the warmth in her eyes was real. David crouched next to them, tapping the drawing lightly. "And who's this big, strong guy right here?" he asked, pointing to the taller figure in the sketch. Amelia beamed. "That's you. You said you'd help us, right?" David smiled, feeling something settle deep within him. "Yeah, kid, I did." Olivia's expression softened, and she took a deep breath, as if releasing the weight of the past. David stepped closer. "So, what now?" Olivia met his gaze. "I rebuild." "From scratch?" She nodded. "From scratch." David hesitated, then said, "You won't have to do it alone." She studied him carefully, as if trying to determine whether he meant the words. "You sure about that?" He smirked. "I don't say things I don't mean." Something flickered in her eyes, something hesitant, yet undeniably hopeful. Then, before she could overthink it, Olivia reached out, fingers curling lightly around his hand. For a fleeting second, doubt crept in. Was she making another mistake, placing her trust in someone who could walk away again? The walls she had built over the years screamed at her to retreat, to protect herself. But as she felt the warmth of his skin against hers, something settled deep inside her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel alone. She let out a quiet breath, her grip tightening slightly, as if grounding herself in this moment, in him. "Stay?" she asked, the single word carrying a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. David squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm staying." The first morning in their new home was far from perfect. The coffee maker sputtered and groaned before giving up entirely. The old plumbing rattled when Olivia turned on the shower, and Amelia, in a fit of discovery, managed to knock over an entire box of cereal onto the kitchen floor. But for the first time in a long while, Olivia found herself laughing. It was a laugh that came freely, unburdened by the weight of expectation or pretense. For years, laughter had been a performance, something rehearsed at charity galas or boardroom meetings, a carefully measured response to social niceties. But this here, in a cramped kitchen with a broken coffee maker and cereal scattered across the floor, was real. She wasn't laughing to impress, to mask, or to maintain an image. She was laughing because, in this moment, she felt something she hadn't in years. Light, free, happy. David leaned against the counter, watching her with an amused smirk. "Didn't take you for the type to enjoy chaos." She scooped up Amelia, pressing a kiss to her daughter's temple. "It's different when it's yours." And it was. This life, simple, unpolished, felt real. The grand estate had been filled with power and luxury, but it had never been filled with warmth. Now, in this tiny kitchen with mismatched furniture and Amelia's laughter ringing through the halls, Olivia felt something she hadn't in years. She felt at home. The weeks passed in quiet, meaningful ways. Olivia found herself embracing a life she never thought she would have. She took Amelia to school herself instead of sending her off with a driver. She learned to cook, though David took great pleasure in teasing her about her less-than-perfect skills. And slowly she began rebuilding her career, not as the CEO of a cold empire, but as someone who wanted to create something that mattered. David, true to his word, stayed. At first he wasn't sure if he could. He had spent most of his life on the move, never tying himself to one place, one person, one future. The idea of permanence had always felt suffocating, like a trap waiting to close in. But here, with Olivia and Amelia, it felt different. It didn't feel like something he was being forced into. It felt like something he was choosing. And for the first time, that choice didn't scare him. He found work in a local repair shop, though he still spent most of his time at home with Olivia and Amelia. He had never thought of himself as someone who needed roots. But here, with them, he found himself wanting to stay. One evening, as they sat on the small porch watching Amelia chase fireflies in the yard, Olivia turned to David. The warm summer air carried the faint scent of jasmine, mingling with the distant hum of crickets. The fireflies blinked like tiny lanterns in the dusk, their glow reflected in Amelia's wide eyes as she twirled barefoot on the grass, giggling each time she managed to cup one in her tiny hands. The world felt slower here, softer, unburdened by the weight of expectations and old wounds. Olivia inhaled deeply, letting the stillness settle inside her, feeling something she hadn't in years: peace. "I never thanked you." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" She smiled softly. "For not letting me push you away. For staying." David exhaled, shaking his head. "Wasn't gonna let you go that easy, Harrington." She laughed, the sound light and easy. "It's just Olivia now." David looked at her, really looked at her, the way her hair fell loose around her shoulders, the way her eyes, once guarded, now held something softer, something open. He reached over, taking her hand. "Then it's just us now." She met his gaze, squeezing his hand in return. "Yeah, just us." And as Amelia ran up to them, breathless with excitement, David knew this was where he was meant to be. He had spent his life drifting, never truly belonging anywhere, always looking for the next town, the next job, the next escape. But now, watching Amelia's bright eyes light up as she reached for his hand, feeling Olivia's steady presence beside him, he realized he wasn't running anymore. He didn't have to. This wasn't just a place he happened to land. It was a home, a place where he was needed, wanted, a place where he could finally stop searching and simply be. Not in the shadows of the past, but here, in the light of something new, something real, a home, a family, a love beyond anything money could ever buy. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you enjoyed this journey of love, redemption, and finding home, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another heartwarming story. Your support means the world to us and helps bring more meaningful content your way. Thank you for being part of this story. Until next time, take care, cherish the people who matter most, and remember, home isn't just a place, it's the love we build.